Hello, everybody, and happy Sunday to you. Welcome to another episode of the Grief Let's Talk About It podcast. I am Tony Lynch. I am your host. Thank you for tuning in today. Now, before we get started, I would like to say, if you have any questions or comments, put those over in the comment section. We'd be happy to answer those as we go along. And today we have a very special guest, but before I bring her up here, I would like to say that this is for educational purposes only. And if this is your first time tuning in and you haven't already, do me a favor, head over to that YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button, and hit that bell notification so you'll be notified every time we drop a new episode. Now, without further ado, my next guest is she's amazing. She's going to come up here. She has a really amazing story. So hopefully you guys enjoy. And let me just do a brief introduction. Today's guest is LaKeisha Barron-Brown, and she's here to tell her story. Hopefully you guys enjoy. So without further ado, here she is. LaKeisha, how you doing today, my friend?
What's up, Tony? How are you doing today?
I am doing well. I'm excited to have you up here. We've talked, remember the first time that we talked forever, right? Yeah. You know what I'm saying? It was a great conversation. And so I just want to say, first and foremost, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You know, take a brief moment and introduce yourself and tell people where you're from.
So yes, Tony, as you stated, my name is LaKeisha Barron-Brown. I'm the owner of Turning Sorrows into Service. So I reside in Charleston, West Virginia. I am an author. I am a mother. I am a community advocate. I am a fashion designer, and I'm just a motivator. I'm one that is out here to help other people understand how to get over their hurdles or where they may be.
Man, that is amazing. You have an amazing story. Now,
thank you.
Let's go back to the beginning before LaKeisha became who she is, right? You know, walk us through your journey in life.
So, Tony, wow, that's a lot to unpack, but I'm willing to do so, right? And so as I stated earlier, I live here in Charleston, West Virginia, have been in West Virginia the majority of my life. So West Virginia is home, but my birthplace was that of Detroit, Michigan. And I still preference the fact that I am from Detroit for many reasons. As we all know, when we're brought into this world, we don't ask for our parents, right? We don't know what life is going to treat us like. And nor does our parents a lot of times know what their life or our life is going to be like once they become parents. Mm-hmm. But what I was brought into was a life of two parents who were heavily addicted to drugs in the early 70s. And much like any individual who's addicted to drugs tend to take over their conscious mindset or their rational behaviors, right? And so ultimately, a lot of my parents' decisions throughout my childhood wasn't based upon if they were good parents or not. It was based upon the fact they were addicted to drugs. Right. And so at a very young age, I would travel back and forth to West Virginia, which is where my mother originates from. But at the early age of, for me, at age of 3, I was at home in Detroit, Michigan with my parents. And I remember very vividly, and I'm not ashamed to say I'm 47, right? So as I reflect back 44 years ago, I remember seeing my father lying on the stairs murdered. Now at 3, one may ask, does a 3-year-old kid really know what murder is? Probably not, right? But I knew of what it meant to try to talk to someone and they not respond back, right? My daddy wasn't responding back to me. And the reason my daddy wasn't responding back to me because my daddy was lying dead on the steps. And so like I say, 44 years later, I still remember what that looked like to have someone there. And that was my first encounter of death that I vividly recall. And so life continued to move forward for me with my mother and I living in Detroit. And again, still pretty regularly coming back to West Virginia because my family here was just as much my caregivers as my parents were for many different reasons, right? Not only were they my caregivers, but it's very fair to believe that they were my protectors. They were my protectors from the unseen of things that I, as a young kid, didn't understand, but they knew was a dangerous situation for any child to be amongst. And obviously, they cared about the older folk, but it was easier to rescue me during those times than what it was for them to get my mother out of that dangerous situation. Right. So I lived here a lot with my relatives, and by the age of about 4 or 5, I remember stating that I wanted to go home with my mom. It was almost time for me to begin kindergarten, and I felt like being with my mother was the place for me to be. Not really realizing at that age why I said that, other than I wanted to be with my mom. And I gradually learned while living with her the why. The why was that my mother still was addicted to drugs. I knew what that looked like. I I vividly remember the smell of the drugs, which was her choice, which was crack cocaine, freebasing at that time. Mm. So as most kids were going to school on a daily basis, that was not my story. My story was, how can I stay at home and protect my mom? How can I make sure that my mother's okay? Not only was she addicted to crack cocaine, but she also had a drinking problem as well. And so as a very young child, you know, oftentimes you think of, if you're in the bathroom and your kid's knocking on the door or just busting in and you're like, I need my private moment. That wasn't my life. I was going inside the bathroom to see if my mother was okay, to make sure that my mother hadn't fallen off the toilet because she was high, either on drugs or either on alcohol. And so life continued for us there in Detroit. But my aunt would always say to me, Tony, LaKeisha, if you want to be somebody, you have to get an education. And I just always thought, why would my mom keep calling my aunt, complaining on me that I wouldn't go to school, right? But I still remember, if you want to be somebody, you have to get an education.
Right.
And one day when I decided to go to school to get an education, it was on March the 1st, 1995. And on that particular day, I had $20 in my pocket. And I share this story quite often with people. When we look at $20 in the 70s, or in the 80s, should I say, in 1985, $20 was a lot of money, right? We can do a lot of things with, you know, chicken nugget, Happy Meals, whatever you may think, but $20 is not a lot today. And so as I had this $20 bill in my pocket, I had dropped it. And obviously my teacher wanted to know who had $20 in their pocket. And as I stated, I lived in a pretty rough place in Detroit. And so when I was asked to go to the office and for my mom to verify to the staff if this money belonged to me, my mother did verify that was the case. And like any other parent would say, you know, I'll see you when you get home. Mm-hmm. And I was anxiously waiting for that bell to ring for many reasons, to get my $20, because she told me to go back to the office, go get my $20, but also to go home. But what I wasn't expecting was for a stranger to approach me to ask me to come back into the schoolyard with him into the office setting. And, you know, in the early 80s, respect was something that was expected of you. Right. And so I didn't question him. I wasn't trying to get in grown folks' business. I just did what I was asked to do. And I went and I sat quietly, but still pretty concerned about what's going on. So after about sitting there, probably about an hour, really probably wasn't even an hour, before a young inquisitive, because I was pretty nosy back then, right? So for a young inquisitive kid, I wanted to know, how much longer is this going to be? I'm going to have to sit here in this chair. And where's my mother? Why have I yet to see my mom? Because my apartment was only literally directly across the street. And so as we left the schoolyard, we then entered into a police car. And even though I grew up in the inner city, no one really knew what my family life was like but me, because I lied about it, right? I didn't tell my family, I didn't tell my friends that my mother was on drugs. I didn't tell my friends the reason why I wasn't coming to school, because why? One, because we were taught what goes in the house stays in the house. So I kept my private business inside my house. And so when I got in the car, I just assumed that my mother had went to jail. So here's this police officer driving, you know, further away from the schoolyard, driving further away from my house. We get to his office. He's typing on the computer. I'm still trying to stay in my little kid place with my inquisitive mindset. And I'm reading words on the paper, but yet not truly recognizing what the words were, not because I couldn't read them, but because I maybe just wasn't trying to put it all together.
Right.
And I remember after he typed up this paper, he took me into an office with a lady, and she asked me if I wanted some candy. I said yes. And she set me on her lap, which was pretty strange because I was taught not to sit on people's laps. But I guess that day I just didn't think about anything else other than my mom. And what I wasn't quite prepared for was for me to then learn that 5 years later, after my father had been murdered, I was now being told my mother had been murdered as well. I must say, Tony, I've told this story often. I rarely cry when I tell this story. But on that day when I found that out, I didn't cry, right? I sat there and I said, okay, you know, and then I was put back in his police car and I was taken to another foreign location, and that being a foster care home. And pretty strange to me because I wasn't really around many Caucasian people in Detroit, but there was, ironically enough, there were some Caucasian kids there. and they were all foreign to me. And I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. My aunt, my mother, my aunt, nobody was there to rescue me. Nobody was there. And all I kept thinking is, when is my aunt going to come rescue me? Because she had always rescued me. That's all I ever knew. You know, she would always rescue me from all the unforeseen dangers I was going through in my life with my parents. And this was one time that I just felt very vulnerable, even though I didn't know what that word meant at a very young age of 8, but I knew it wasn't my norm. I knew it wasn't my norm that when I wasn't with my mom, I was with strangers. My norm was if I wasn't with my mother, I was with my aunt. Right. And so I would sort of stop there and allow you to maybe jump in. But I mean, that's the early stages of my life before leaving Detroit, coming to West Virginia.
Yeah, well, I was just sitting over here thinking, and we talked about this before. You know, you just witnessed both of your parents, similar incidents. They both was murdered, right? Yes. You know, and as you said before, you know, how does a child process this? Mm-hmm. And you know, one was at 3, the other one was at 8. You know, 5 years apart. You know, and so now I'm like, you know, I guess I would just ask the question outright. How are you processing this? You know, you I know now you've thrown into a world, you're still young, right? You know, and you mentioned before that you didn't cry. Yeah. But now, how are you processing this as you begin to move forward?
And so that is a very interesting question, right? Because I didn't know how I was processing it. As we know, to no fault of anyone's, you know, is a very cultural misunderstanding for us as African-American people. What goes on in the home stays in the home. You just don't talk about it, right? And so at that young age, I didn't understand why no one was talking about it. But as I'm older today, I understand, and we can dive into that a little bit later. But as a young kid, I always felt like that when my mother's casket closed, so did everybody else's mouth, you know. And again, as I dive a little bit more into that, I think the viewers and the listeners will be able to understand the reasons of why that I may have felt that way as a kid. But being that I couldn't talk about it when I moved here to West Virginia, I didn't talk about it. I didn't talk about it with friends that I had made. I didn't talk about it with my relatives. I didn't talk about it with anyone. But what I did was I acted out. I acted out on it. Now, when I say I acted out, my family didn't know I was acting out, but fighting became my habit, my hobby. I didn't enjoy watching boxing, right? But I loved to fight. And I didn't understand the reasons of the why that I learned to fight. I mean, that I loved to fight. But what I realized was that it was a lot of anger built up in me that I just had to figure out a way to get it out. You know, at that young age, I didn't understand that hurt people. But what I knew was I wanted to hurt somebody. And I was going to hurt somebody. Many times I did. And if I were to be able to go back today and apologize to all those people, I would. But yet I don't know who half of those people were, because everybody was my enemy. Everybody was my problem. And so again, hurt people. So when you ask me, how did I process it? Positively, I didn't, but I only knew what to do with what I had, because no one ever asked me, Keisha, how are you? No teachers did, because the teachers really didn't know either, you know. But if I can tell a crazy story, I remember being in 5th grade. I had this African-American teacher, and I guess I had an attitude that I did. I will claim that, right? I had this chip on my shoulder. I had an attitude. Understood. Everybody was my problem, and you gonna get it, right? And so I remember my 5th grade teacher saying, tomorrow we're gonna fight, and I want you to meet me downstairs at the front door first thing in the morning. Well, what she didn't know was that this girl loved to fight from the city. And so every morning, my sister and I will always walk to school together. This particular morning, well, she would always wake me up for school. This particular morning, I was up and ready way before she was. She didn't have to worry about me being late to school that morning, because she didn't know I had an agenda. And my agenda was to meet my teacher. Yeah. My agenda was to meet my teacher, because she challenged me, right? Now, what kid would think it would be okay, but I did at that point. But she challenged me. And so I remember walking into the school door, and there she stood. And I remember her balling her fist up at me, and I said, I wish you would. I wish you would hit me. And she backed up for a second, right? And I later learned that her thought was, how can I break this kid? Because she had never had a city kid in her classroom who just had so much attitude and anger that she couldn't get through. But she didn't understand my story, and nor was I willing or able to tell her what my story was. And so, again, as a young kid, I didn't process well. I didn't know how to process other than to fight. So if that is the answer, to that question, then that would be how I processed as a kid, because even then I never cried until I was 18 years old from my mother's death at 18. Is when I finally cried.
See, I understand that, right? Because it's the same across the board. And when I'm talking with people or educating people about the secondary language when it comes down to grief, especially if you don't understand it, right? It's anger. And the question that comes after that a lot of times is, why is that? I go, well, because it's a love language when you don't understand how to articulate what's going on with you. Yes. Especially when it comes down to young men, right? Now, culturally, we're not taught, like you said before, we're not taught those things. What stays in the house, what happens in the house stays in the house. So when we experience murder, or for a better word, when we experience homicides or overdoses and things like that, especially within the culture that we're raised in, we watch what everyone else does.
Right.
Now, it's not like that across the board, because there are some cultures where if something like this happens, they do know how to grieve. Say, for instance, in African or European cultures, and for the most part, in different countries, they often know how to have certain rituals, right? They often encourage the expressions of emotions. Now, Eastern, here in the United States, Western cultures, in Western cultures over here in the United States, we get taught, hey, just life keeps going. Our family members, because those are the people who normally teaches us the morals and values that we use as we become adults, through adolescence, teenage years, into adult years. They're the ones who teach us what we need to know, or supposed to be what we need to know. Now, as we've gotten older, we realize that they were never taught these things neither. Exactly. So, of course, when we get taught not to, when we're not taught certain things, acting out is just another way that I realize now that we do ask for help, right? Yes. And if you don't understand it, if you don't understand the language, you would look at us and go, they are just angry children. Yes. They're angry human beings, they're angry adults and things like that, and not understanding this is our way of saying, I'm hurt. And you said something very interesting. And it's if people understand this, hurt people. We don't intentionally do it. But when we experience trauma like that, we, as you said, we work with what we have. We do the best at what we know.
Right.
So I can relate to the fighting part, because these things right here, used to be hurting all the time. Like, I'm just going to fight somebody. But it wasn't until, like you said, as I got older, I didn't really cry. Like you had 18, so you got a little bit more experience on me than that. I didn't start crying until I was almost 40, in my 40s.
Wow.
And even then, I wouldn't cry around anyone because of the expectations that people had of me.
Yes.
Right. And I think it's the same, at 18 years old, what was that part that pushed you into your emotions that you began to cry?
Well, I think by then, obviously by 18, I was off to college. So I was away from everything, right? Like only I had really at that time, outside of the new folk whom I met that really still didn't know me, was myself. Right. And so whether I felt lonely, alone when I was with my family, I still knew that they were my protectors, if that makes sense. And I wasn't there vulnerable by myself. Whether we talked about what was going on, the reality was they were hurting just as much as I. So not only was I hurting and couldn't talk, they may have been, well, we know they were hurting and couldn't talk either. So it was just everybody just be quiet about it, right? But I know they was there to protect me. So I think it was just a matter of going off to college, to somewhere foreign, happy to leave, right? So happy to leave, but yet this is the real world. And I knew you can't keep fighting. Like, this ain't it. Like, you're trying to get an education. This is what your aunt told you needed an education. You graduate from high school. Now you have to graduate from college. But if I make a poor decision, it's a wrap, And so I think when I realized that I could no longer fight people, didn't mean I still didn't have an attitude, because believe me, I did. But I knew that fighting wasn't the answer anymore. And I realized I'm just going to have to figure out how to gradually deal with my reality, whether I want to or not. And so I think that that's really what my breaking or my aha moment came in, is that this is your real life, and you are who you are. Your story is your story, and there's nothing you can do about it other than accept it, whether I wanted to or not.
Okay. Now, in college, because I find that very fascinating, because it happened when you was away from everyone, and I think a lot of times it takes us going into that isolation, being away from people that can influence our emotions, right? Because as much as we hate to admit it, the people around us that we look up to, our protectors, they do influence us emotionally in so many different ways. And we gravitate to that because in deep down inside, as young individuals, we are still trying to appease and uphold the expectations that they have of us.
Yes.
Right. And so if they're not talking about it, we're not talking about it. If they're not crying, we're not crying, because and I can only speak from a male's perspective at this moment. Because as a young male, I was always taught that was part of weakness, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, young men don't cry, you got to man up, suck those tears in, right? And so I think for me, it took a little bit longer to get out of the aggressive state. Like, I always thought that was okay because I was always in violent surroundings. Right. Being a young game banger and things like that, I was always around violent surroundings. And I believe that was my release as I began to walk and navigate through life. But also, with the current situations, being homeless and all of those different things, like, I never really let things get to me, because it was like I could come to a place of acceptance really quick. Like, hey, I just lost four homies, right?
Right.
I'm not even going to worry about it. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to catch the next person that I don't like, and I'm about to get them, period, point blank. And I was sucking up, but I realized that was part of the process of grieving that no one ever taught me about, because I think a lot of times they didn't know neither.
Exactly right.
Right. And so it was just easier for me to navigate, keep my mouth shut, keep my head down, and just keep it moving through. Because, like yourself, being alone, loneliness was my friend.
Yeah.
Right. And it was easier for me in so many ways to not let anyone into my life, because life had taught me that people could hurt me. And
Tony, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
It's funny that you say that. So again, when I look at my life and I look at how trauma recycles itself, right? Even when you don't consciously remember that. So I know for me, and even to this day, I'm very cautious about who I let in my inner circle. And the reason for that is because I had no control over losing my mom. I had no control over losing my dad, which were prior to the other, death we will talk about later in this episode. That I felt like if I keep you on the outside and I don't want to deal with you, then it's easier for me to push you away than you coming in, me letting you in, and you just walk away, because I felt open again to a wound that I didn't want to feel anymore. So like I say, I've gotten better as I've gotten older, but trauma is trauma, right? PTSD is PTSD. No matter what you do, you can go through all the therapy, you can do all the healing you want, but your brain still has pictures of things that's went on in your life that you cannot erase. And so your brain is your protector for many different things, right? And so, like I say, even my personality today, I am very, very cautious about who I let in my life, because I know I can control pushing you out. So I'm not going to let you in too much. I don't want you to walk out too quickly and I not be ready for that. I was like that more so when I was younger than what I am today. But I know that for sure when I was younger, that was definitely a defense mechanism of mine. I didn't have many friends, and I was okay with that. I don't have as many friends today either, because I'm still a me person, but I'm a little bit more open to allowing people in just a tad bit more than what I did as a young kid who didn't understand what I was going through. So it was my defense mechanism.
Understood. And that defense mechanism is something else, right? It's something that we can always rely on, right? And I often go like this. This is where the reality comes in, right? we have trust issues. It's crazy as it is, but I think a lot of people, first off, I want to say thank you for the people who are tuning in on IG. If you guys have any questions while you're listening, please put those in. We will be sure to answer for everyone who's tuning in on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. If you guys have any questions, put those in the comments. We'll get to them as we go. So yeah, like I was saying before, those trust issues are something different, especially when we begin to explore those relationships, right? Not just the friendships, but the intimate ones, right? And not understand that, like, a lot of times I never understood why I was the way that I was. Like I was always watching for people to try to do something to me. And that way I knew how to pivot. Right. But also back when I was younger, I was very petty too. Like even now, like depending on the situation, I can be pretty petty. Like, you going to do what? Okay, watch what I do. Right. Like, it's a battle of the pettiness.
Right.
And makes sense. Back then I was petty. If I knew that you was going to try to do something to me, I would take petty to the next level. Right. And not saying that I was right or anything, but when with the intimate relationships and things, like, if I knew that you was going to be that you was going to do something, your friends are now on limits for me. They're no longer off limits. I'm about to do something, and all your friends get to sit around and talk about the things that I just did. Right. And you're gonna be like, holy crap, you did what? Yeah, I did that. Yeah, I did. Right. And have no remorse about it. I did pay for it. Karma came back and was like, don't do that, Tony.
Right. Karma's real. Karma's real.
It was real. It was very real. Now, being in a college setting, away from everyone, you're adjusting, but you have this PTSD. You have these memories that you're living with. How was college life for you?
Well, if any of my college friends are watching this live right now, their stories may be a tad bit different than mine. I'm just going to say they may be a tad bit different than mine. Nothing that they can jump in on and leave no comments if they're watching, but I love all of y'all. But college was interesting, right? Because college was the next phase of me. College was the next phase of grief for me. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later. Because when I got to college, I still was a sort of naive young girl. I entered into college dating my high school boyfriend, who later will reappear in this story. But I still was damaged, right? When I went off to college, I still was damaged, and I still had some other things that was part of me that didn't deal with my parents. I'll just leave it there. It didn't deal with my parents. And so because of some of those things, I think pretty early on in my college life, I made some decisions that probably was a little quick to the draw of interacting with other people, that being males. One male in particular who later became a part of my life for a lifetime, because we have kids together. Probably my anger a lot of times, he took heat for initially. And I had to realize you can't hit him, right? Because after hitting him so many times, what you gonna tell your daddy if he really hits you back? So I had a control issue too, right? Like, you can't keep hitting this man, because if you do, it's not gonna go well for you one day. And there's nothing you can tell your daddy for him to say, you're not at fault. And so I had to realize then that I had to step back a little bit, and I had to stop being aggressive and how we're gonna work this thing out or start this thing or whatever we was trying to get going. So college life was me getting involved with a man who was also a student at Marshall. And later he became the father of my first child. And then we later went on to get married, and we had our second child. So college for me was more so partying, relationship, and children. And what I want to believe the beginning of my healing process. And lifetime friends. I joke about who's watching this, but a lot of my lifetime friends who's helped me along the way of healing is where I met. I met them in college as well.
Okay. Yeah. Now, did you start to tell people, or like open up to where people understood where that was coming from?
Yeah, I did. So ironically, two instances I remember opening up, or maybe just one, I can't remember. Um, I had a communication class, and I had to do a communication. One, I had to speak. So I did open up twice. I had to speak, and I spoke about being a crack baby. All right. And so everybody's looking at me like a crack baby. You know, who openly talks about being a crack baby? Nobody openly talk about being a crack baby. Well, what they didn't realize was this crack baby had to talk about how I was cracked on the inside, right? How my heart was cracked, how my life was cracked, how everything about me was cracked because of crack. And so I did talk about that. And so having that experience was great because it developed me into a speaker, because I had to talk about something that was very personal to me, that I was opening my book to give to somebody else to either, understand, critique, or ask further questions. And so that was my first time really opening up to what I would call strangers, because again, those weren't my friends in that classroom. This was just students who signed up for Communication 101. And so then later, when I was in my English class, I had to write a paper. And in my paper, I went on to write a little bit more about it. And obviously, now that I'm older and I'm a little bit more educated and a little bit more knowledgeable and wiser, that really could have been some of my healing as well. But I just didn't realize that was it. But I was getting my feelings in my life out on paper. And, as a therapist myself, that's something that we teach people is you need to write out what you're feeling. And so again, at that young age of 19, 20, I didn't realize really that's what I was doing. Why? Because I never went to therapy before.
Right. Okay.
And so I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I would say, I don't really know as far as me verbalizing it to my friends or those who look like me that begin to become friends to me. For me, I don't know exactly when I verbally start telling them my story. It may honestly not have been until I got pregnant with my daughter, and I'll allow you, to ask the question, Tony, that you'll have, but I'll tell you again how trauma then represented itself when I was pregnant with my daughter.
Okay. Well, you primarily answered that question for me, and I was just wondering, the relationships that you had and everything. No one really asked questions, right? That's to me is understandable, because a lot of times, people do not ask the questions. They just kind of look at us like we're crazy and things like that, But now, you finally are realizing the problem and things like that, and now you're in college. And now, when did did you ever open up to your boyfriend
I did. Yeah,
I did. A better understanding of what LaKeisha was going through and things like that, because you already beat him up. But
well, just in case he's watching this, I can't say I literally beat him up. I would just say I probably wasn't, the nicest at times. Is what I will open. I'll accept my faults, right?
I understand that, but I do have a younger sister. That's why I said you probably beat him up, because my little sister will beat me up from time to time, and I had to think about it, like how can I get her back? But but again, like when you raised in a household, with older brother, younger sister, petty goes to a whole new level. But I think she out petted me though. She would get me. She would definitely get me. But I'm building the relationship, between or building the understanding how those relationships form. Was there reconciliation for because hurt people, or did that come a little bit later? Because how long were you in college?
So I was in college for my undergrad for 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah. And so when you asked me if I opened up and I shared my story, I must digress, just go back just a tad bit. As I had made mention early on, my first, what I would call my real boyfriend that I had in my life was in high school. And he was the first person I opened up with everything about my life, things that I've not shared here. He probably is the only person male-wise that knows that knew everything about me.
Right.
So he was the first person that knew about, my story, my what's, my whys, which I think allowed for us to have a closer relationship, because some of our stories, not everything about our story was similar, but the hurt of losing a parent was very similar. So he was my first confidant in that conversation. And then when I went off to college and then I met my children's father, a different gentleman, I don't remember telling him, but I'm sure I did. But I'm gonna be honest with you. Our relationship I wouldn't say initially started out on building those foundations of understanding.
Understood.
Without going too deep into that.
No,
We just
understood.
happened
I
to
understood
be,
that in between the lines right there.
Yeah. We just happened to be, two young kids in school who found each other attractive for whatever the reason may have been, further into, that, furthered into, I would say, feelings along the way, but still sort of selfish in our own way of what we thought we were going to still do in our own personal lives and not really combine our lives together. And, thankfully to our daughter, I think that's when life became a little bit more serious for us. He knew by that point that I had lost parents, but I don't think it's really ever a conversation that we ever really sat down and talk about how does that make you feel? How has that affected you? I don't think that our relationship was ever to that point. I think our relationship was built upon something that didn't allow for that conversation to be there, because that's not how it started.
Okay, understood. Definitely understood. I was because I can relate to what you just said right there, especially coming from a place of being an introvert. I was never into letting people into my life because, again, protective mechanism, right? I had to have that boundary. I had to put those walls. What I didn't realize is that how many walls I put up,
right,
throughout life, right? And a lot of it came from just being afraid.
Yeah.
I had to admit that as I got older, like once I started to reflect back on my life and those relationships, because I did damage a lot of relationships because I was afraid, good women, good women. Right. But I was not able to connect with them, on that personal level. Right. And I don't blame them for anything or anything like that. I take full responsibility for that because, I could have been a better human being, but I wasn't, because culturally, I was prone to violence, right? And I was prone to go F off. If, saying if I felt that you was no benefit of me to me or anything like that, like I don't need you around. Bye. Go on about your way. I'll do me. Right. And so that's I'm figuring out the similarities across the board. And what I'm starting to realize that it was like that across the board for many of us. Right. Grief was something that I never understood. And so getting what I'm listening from you is that pretty much the same thing. It was never understood. When did you realize what grief was, right? What you're carrying around with you, and in how that's affecting not just your relationship with yourself, but like relationships with family and friends, etc.
Yeah, so I got pregnant with my second child in 1999, had him in 2000. And I was dealing they thought my son was going to have some health issues. And so I remember distancing myself away from my family for a little bit. And during that time, I read a book and it talked about building foundations, and that you got to, the individual is a house, right? And you had to break your house down. You had to build your house up from the ground up. And so I realized that I had to start working on my house. And what did that mean? That meant I had to start working on some things I had never worked on before. And I had to start rebuilding myself for me and for my kids. And so that's really where it started. And so that's also when I began working on my master's degree. I started my master's degree initially in leadership studies. And I found that I started taking more counseling classes, right? But I thought I was just taking them because it was an elective. And I knew I wanted to be a probation officer at that time. And so one of my college friends was also in the master's program, and she was a probation officer. And I asked her about, her steps to get in there. And she's like, well, you really should go into correctional counseling. And so as I found myself taking more counseling classes, I started looking at myself, right?
Okay.
And I remember this one particular class in general, and it was called Family Ties. And the question that was asked of us was, how do you define yourself within your family? And obviously I had never thought about that because my family unit is my family unit. That's what I've always known.
Mm-hmm.
And so without much thought, when it came time for me to answer the question, I said, and I described myself as that puzzle piece. And I said, and I gave people a visual, and I'll give the audience a visual here. Like if you've ever done a jigsaw puzzle, you got all these little small pieces on the table. And as you get closer to the end, you have a few pieces that's left that look like it should fit, right? And the more and more you try to fit that puzzle piece into that space where it looked like it should fit, it just keep bending. And I said, oh, wait, and I didn't say wait out loud to the classmates and my teacher. Internally, I said, wait, because I had never thought about that. But what I realized was, wait a minute, you've been raised by your aunt. You've been raised in her home. And I didn't go into this much, but by this point, when I was younger, my aunt, who wanted me to feel like I wasn't no longer a niece living in her home, that I was her daughter, she asked me to call her mom. And I did. But through this moment of counseling, my counseling class, I realized that, again, I was that puzzle piece, right? I was that puzzle piece who looked like my family, who we all had the same genes, our parents were sisters, but yet that was not my mom and dad. So no matter how much I tried to fit myself into that space, no matter how much they were including me into that space, I just wasn't fitting. And it wasn't their fault solely, but it was a combination of many things. Mm-hmm. And so I realized I was just that little puzzle piece over here by myself, trying to figure out where exactly do I fit at? How am I going to fit into this large piece of this puzzle and be okay? How am I going to feel whole? And so that's at the point to where I realized that was grief. That was the time that I began to heal on things that had been unhealed. And that was the loss of my parents.
Okay. Now, and that makes total sense, right? And I grab onto that very intimately because I did something similar, although I didn't have anyone to help navigate that part because I never went to therapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, I was one of those guys that fell into the stigma. I can't go to therapy. I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
Right. And most young men, black, white, doesn't matter what you are, if you're raised around a culture, the stigma that comes along with it, I'm not going to do that. I now realize the importance of having someone to help you be honest with yourself and begin to start that healing process.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because I didn't know what that was neither. Heal from what? I'm not damaged. I'm not what? Right. No. But I realized that there was a lot that needed to go along with that. Now, you did experience another major loss.
I experienced two.
You experienced, okay. Let's if you don't mind, let's talk about those.
Well, I say I experienced two, but if I can be honest, I experienced three, right? Okay. Because I know oftentimes when people think of grief, we think of people literally passing away, but grief is losing something that was your norm. And you have to figure out, how do I readjust and go back to a new life of norm? So I want to say, after the loss of my parents, my next stage of grief or loss, should I say, was my ex-husband. I divorced the father of my children, the gentleman whom I met in college. Okay. And so I must say, many times I held on to that relationship. Again, let's talk about trauma. I held on to that relationship and stayed married for quite some time because I thought, well, better yet, I got married really first because I thought that's what my kids needed because I didn't have it. Right. I thought my kids needed a mother and father in their home because I didn't have it. And that's what I desired. And so my trauma, my wants, and what I needed, I then impacted that onto my kids' life. And so, not to say I didn't marry their father because we didn't love each other, but let me be real. That wasn't the sole reason I married him. I married him because I wanted my kids to have what I didn't have. Right. And so then I indirectly placed trauma into my kids' life unknowingly because I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do as a parent. Okay. And so I then moved on into this relationship, and I came to a point one day, Tony, I said, wait a minute, my kids don't need a husband and wife. They need a mother and father. I don't need to be married for me to still take the title on as a mother, and for their father to take the role and title on as a father. So if this ain't working, I'm not going to continue to impose trauma on my kids for what I needed. Okay. Right. So yeah. I would say there was a loss there because I had to learn how to rebuild from that. I had to financially learn how to rebuild. I had to now say it's all on you to figure out how to be a parent of 2 small toddlers, rebuild financially, rebuild mentally, rebuild emotionally. All of that I had to learn how to do that by myself as a single mother with 2 small kids. And so I would say that was the loss that I had to learn how to grieve from. And so from there, Tony, my high school sweetheart came back into my life, and we rekindled our relationship. And he moved into my home. He then became a wonderful stepfather to my children. So he took on that father role that my kids needed and so desired. And then we ended up conceiving a child ourselves, which is our younger son. And New Year's Eve on 2018. Unfortunately, he passed from a heart disease. And so I had to deal with trauma twice from that, right? I had to deal with trauma because he was someone who I told you when it was time to unpack my story as a young kid, he was that person for me. He was my voice. He was my listening ear. So I had to deal with that person that was my calm during my storm was no longer there to keep me calm anymore. And I had to figure this out again with another child that I had to raise by myself. Understood. And so then here I am left grieving with that. But then I had a 9-year-old kid who now have lost his father. So that 9-year-old kid's life now looks like his 40-some-year-old mother, who was an 8-year-old kid who lost her last parent, And so it was so many different things that spun into this big web that I had to unravel to be there for my son. It wasn't so much being there for myself. I had to help my son navigate this because, he loves his mother, but he was his father's son. Like everywhere his father went, he went. And I knew I couldn't provide that same thing because I wasn't his father, So I had to figure out, how do I now raise this 9-year-old kid and do the best I can do, but know his father is not coming back. It's not a matter of me calling him up saying, hey, can you come help me raise your son? So I had to learn how to adjust to that new norm. And then alongside of that, making sure that my older kids was okay, because that was their father figure as well. And the hardest death for me, Tony, was the death of my son. My 21-year-old son passed away on October 26, 2021 from COVID. Prior to contracting COVID, he found out he had kidney disease, and the process of his kidney disease happened pretty quickly in reference to his lifespan. We found out in February of 2021. Again, by October 2026, my son had been hospital several times. The last hospital stay, unfortunately, he contracted COVID inside the hospital, and he wasn't able to he wasn't able to fight that off because his immunity was not where it needed to be. Right. So as I talk about that being the hardest death, and the reason for that is because all the other losses I talked about was heartaches. They were heartbreaks. The loss of my son truly took a part of my heart away that nobody can repair. Nobody can mend that back together, And so my mending that I do is come out and I speak to people about what grief really looks like. Grief is not always someone crying. Grief is not always someone laid up in the bed, depressed. Grief does come in different forms. And so, Tony, I would have to say that was my hardest death that I faced. But even though it's the hardest death I faced, it's made me into who I am today. As strange as it may seem to the listeners today, it has probably made me much stronger than what I've ever been. So tears don't make you weak. Okay. So as I sit here and cry today, that's not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of a grieving mother who misses her son. But my son's death has made me very strong in my mission, my purpose, and my motives as I live forth today, every day.
First off, I want to say thank you for sharing that. And if you need to take a minute to, just to get yourself together and everything, my heart is always with you, because we talked about this before, right? Yeah. And child loss is hard. I mean, and I say that lightly because there's no words, right? There's no words for that, and you've experienced like major losses throughout, including yourself.
Yeah.
And so I want to say, first, again, thank you for sharing that. And my heart is always with you.
Thank you.
We talked about this, no one wants to be a part of this club, right?
Right.
Fortunately, we are.
Yeah.
And, it's very encouraging. You're a very inspiring
Thank you.
woman because, with the work that you do now, you kind of took everything, but you carried that with you, not as a badge of shame or anything like that, but you carried that with you as a badge of courage. And for anyone out there who is listening, this is very courageous because you learned how to take it and do something positive with it, right? But and also, your tears are a sign of strength. It took me a long time to figure out that as well, right? Because I was with the way that we're taught. So thank you for that, right? And don't ever, if you need to let those tears flow, let them flow. Don't ever be ashamed, not around me and not around our listeners neither.
Yeah.
Pretty sure everyone who's listening right now have experienced exactly what you're going through. So, and if they're following along, if they got tears in your eyes, please let those things flow, because we're all a part of this. We're all part of this human race, and it is okay. It is okay to share your tears with us. Because we're going to share ours with you as well.
Sure.
I was tearing up as you were saying, and I was like, "Man, I'm tearing up with you." Just so you know, you're not in it by yourself, which you already know. So, we walk together.
Yeah.
Now, you've you started doing something with this and encouraging other people. What was that point that made you say, "You know what? I'm going to take this and I'm going to do something with this"?
So, Tony, as my son was beginning to transition, my daughter and I, I'm sorry, his sister, my daughter and I, which she's the oldest, we whispered in his ear that his legacy would not go anywhere, that we will continue his legacy. As he was a young boy at 21 years old, he wasn't just somebody special to me, right? He probably was more special to me than what he was to anybody else. But he wasn't just special to me. He truly was a light in the community. And so we wanted to continue that light to shine, whether he's here or not, just like the sun rays, right? I'm looking at the background of you and I'm seeing the sunshine, right? That's who my son was to me. That's who I know that my son was to the community. And so I vowed that this town would not be left in darkness because he wasn't here. And so I was going to continue to shine his light. And so my daughter and I vowed the things that he had forth in this community, it was going to continue on. And so one of the things that my son did at the start of COVID was started a basketball league. And so we continued that and we provide resources to the community. But one of my single endeavors that I've done myself without the help of my daughter, but the support of my daughter, was, as you see here, my title was Turning Sorrow into Service. Mm-hmm. And so I immediately began to trademark that. And I immediately began to say, I can't sit in sorrow, right? I have to allow my sorrow to become my service. And so that's when I then trademarked Turning Sorrow into Service. So everything I do is turning sorrow into service. And so what I realized, though, also, Tony, was that wasn't new for me, right? It was new to my mindset, but the actions weren't new. From a young kid, I was already taught you're facing sorrow and you have to keep moving forward. And so that's sort of what inspired me, was my son's death, of turning my sorrow into service. So what does that mean, right? What does that mean, Keisha, when the audience are asking, keep going, what does that mean? What that means is that everything I do, even when I may be hurting on the inside, I want to impact someone else to know that if your story looks like mine, if your story don't look like mine, but has some similarities, right? I'm here to help empower people to know, just because your shoe don't fit into mine, right? Your shoe still has the tread on it to keep walking and to keep moving forward to what the next step may be for you of perseverance. It may hurt, right? Like if you had to walk miles and miles and miles, that may get tiring after a while, but if you keep walking it, it'll get easier, right? And so that's what my mission is. My mission is to help people understand that grief is not easy. And grief, as we know, there is no destination to when it's over. There is no destination. There's no date on the calendar to say it starts here and it's going to end tomorrow. That ain't true.
Right.
For all the people who tell people get over it, it's over, it's been a long time ago, that ain't true. But what I do is I find a way to inspire people to know you don't have to be in the dumps every day, all day. But your memories don't leave you, right? But you can't stop living, even though at times it feels like that you are dead on the inside yourself. And I don't mean to use that word negatively, but sometimes that's how grief makes you feel, right? And so that's what I use my platform, I use my business to inspire other people. And I do that in many different components, not just speaking, by writing, by my clothing design. I have a clothing line that also talks about determination and ambition, which is your DNA, right? We all have DNA, but when we think of DNA, Tony, we think of biological DNA. But what I tell people is emotionally, right? Everybody that's listening, Tony, you, me, everybody that's listening, we all have DNA, and that's determination and ambition to get wherever it is you need to get to based upon your story and based upon your situations. Even though life sometimes want to push us down, Tony, as I am turning sorrow into service, I want people to know it is possible, even when it seems like it's not.
I love that. I definitely love that right there. Your clothing line, your business and everything, how you turned everything around and became a servant to the communities that we're around. Such a powerful, powerful walk. Now, before as we begin to wrap this up, I always ask my guests this, right? If you could leave the audience with something today, what would you leave them with?
Be patient, right? Be patient with yourself. Be patient with your emotions. Be patient with your mental health. Just be patient. And why? Because again, it's not a destination. It's not a race. There is no end time. Some days you're going to feel happy. Some days you're going to feel sad. You're going to think everything feels okay. And then before we know it, it creeps back up again. And we can't let ourselves down, because even though I may tell my story, nobody truly knows what I feel like on the inside but me. So I still have to be patient with myself. When I leave this call today, I'm still going to be patient, because I'm going to have to still wrap it up. I'm going to have to pull it in, because life still goes on for me, right? I still have other kids that still need their mother to show up. I have a grandson who still needs his grandmother to show up, or his BB, as he so know me to be. But my words to people is just be patient with yourself. As other people may not be patient with you because they don't understand you. They don't understand your grief. The only person who you have control over is you. You are the only person that can be patient with yourself when others are not. And that would be my words to people.
Now, before we wrap this up, you wrote a book, didn't you?
I did.
Tell people where they can find your book. You got a copy of what your book looks like, right?
I do. Now I got this virtual thing. Can you see that?
I can see that. Through the eye of the crack, huh?
Through the eye of a cracked soul. I'm not sure if I'm in the camera.
I love that.
So Tony, that is my book. My book is currently on my website, which is www.nosorrows.com. Mm-hmm. And Through the Eye of the Cracked Soul talks solely about my life from a child to my college life. So as I did not unravel everything on here, it was strategic, right? Because I want to encourage people to get my book to read my life, right? Because I'm sure people are still wondering how do we jump from 8 to 18? It's impact within the book. So you can find my book on Amazon, and as I stated, on my personal website, which is www.nosorrows.com.
See, and that's, again, very strategic. I want people to come in, because we talked about your book, and so there's a lot more to unpack in there. So please, by all means, people, her information is in the description. Go over there and check it out. Now, where can people find you?
Yes, so I'm on Facebook. With my biological name, LaKeisha Barron-Brown is my Facebook name. I am on Instagram, LaKeisha Barron-Brown _author. So that's my hashtag on Instagram. On LinkedIn, it's going to be LaKeisha Barron-Brown. And then I'm also on YouTube as LaKeisha Barron-Brown. And then under my TikTok is my where I shoot a lot of videos and put a lot of inspirational words and words of what to do and what not to do sometimes when dealing with grief. And so that hashtag is LaKeisha Barron-Brown _author.
Awesome. And you guys are going to see a lot more of her, especially go to her TikTok. We're going to be connecting over there as well. We're going to do a whole lot more stuff. For everyone who's been tuning in, thank you guys for tuning in. This is going to wrap up this episode of the Grief Let's Talk About It podcast. LaKeisha, thank you for being on the show. for everyone, if you haven't already, you made it down to the end, do me a favor, head over to that YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell notification. And if you know anyone that can benefit from these conversations, please share this with them as well. But also make sure you go check out LaKeisha's YouTube channel. And because she's going to have a lot of great content over there as well. And this is, like I said, this is going to conclude this. And for everyone out there, thank you for your support. Thank you guys for tuning in. And until next time, guys, we love you. And you guys keep your head up. And always remember, this walk of grief that you do, you're not alone. And we always have something for everyone. So make sure we always encourage that you get the support that you need and the support that you deserve. And begin your healing process. This is going to conclude this one. You guys have a great day. Peace.